The final speaker in this session to kickstart today's proceedings is John Punter. John is our international guest. He's on the steering committee for our research project, and that partly explains why he's here today. But his credentials as a researcher, as a writer, as a thinker about urban design, particularly from a planning perspective, are compelling regardless. He's held academic positions in Toronto, Reading and Glasgow, before becoming Professor of Urban Design at Cardiff University in 1996. He's no blow-in overseas expert, being the author of a definitive monograph on designing post-war central Sydney, which some of you will know about, and which he largely researched and wrote during study leave at UNSW in 2002. This morning, John is looking at design excellence provisions and practices in a wider perspective for us, drawing primarily on recent experience, setbacks and challenges in the UK. So, John.
Thank you very much, Rob. I can't tell you what a thrill it is to be back in Sydney. Just getting out of UNSW and walking the streets and looking at everything, and this time particularly the quality of the light is something really, really special, and how everything sparkles, etc. So it's a real bonus to come here for a few days and to escape from South Wales to New South Wales. South Wales is quite a contrast, really. We don't talk much about design excellence. We do talk about design improvement and trying to make things better. And unlike England, which has lost its design agency, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, who've done sterling work really over the last 15, something like that, years. We still exist. The Design Commission for Wales still exists, but we operate on a relatively shoestring budget. We think we do improve the environment, but boy, is it a struggle in an economy which is sometimes at the margins, where there is a reluctance to change, but yet where there is an extraordinary physical environment which really needs careful attention. But I'm going to talk really about the English context, because I think that has probably got more to do with New South Wales and Sydney. And yesterday when I was at UNSW, I talked about London and the London housing crisis. And I know that that has enormous relevance to Sydney. In a way, I'm absolutely delighted to be here on the day when, you know, we talk about better placed as a document, but we have the double bonus really of a chief architect talking about the whole question of the typology of housing and the importance of thinking of new ways of intensification that are going to be valuable for the city, that are potentially cheaper perhaps to produce, more accessible to a wider section of the population, etc. And I think starting where he's starting with this notion of the middle ground and sort of 3-4 story street-oriented housing is a very good place to start. So anyway, let me go back and I will have to talk a little bit about better placed, because I think that summarises some of the key issues from my perspective. And then I've got to come on and talk about Rob's project, which has been is very interesting but very focused. So the first thing I want to say is that design placed, I think, is a really bold step for New South Wales, and I welcome it with considerable praise really for this relationship between architecture and planning, It's been it's been impossible in the British context to get architecture and planning to really come together in a creative way. I think CABE managed it, but of course CABE has been abolished. So it's this synergy between architecture and planning that Terry Farrell was commenting on in the aftermath of CABE, and saying that we should really have a chief architect and chief planner who are working side by side. Well, at least there's a prospect of that here. So I think that's something which is very significant. I read through the principles, the processes, and the outputs very carefully, because we're always in the business of conceptualizing in academia, and I thought it was a pretty rigorous attempt, really, and quite convincing. I picked out something which I think is particularly important, which is the emphasis on sustainability, and more important even than that, if there is anything more important than sustainability, and there probably isn't, equity and fairness as principles. And I thought that, given the context of London and perhaps in the context of Sydney, that was particularly significant. So what we're offered is a key role for the government architect within the Department of Planning, a design-led planning strategy. I've heard this word design-led planning strategy so many times and seen in the UK, and the results are less than, they're very, very underwhelming. But at least here I think there's the prospect of this genuine architectural input and concern with quality design. So the other thing about the document, which of course is really significant, is that it draws on the work of CABE very extensively, the value of urban design, design route practices, particularly those two things which have really dominated the way in which CABE work. They've also talked about the indivisibility of good design and good planning. And that's a quote actually from a piece of guidance that was produced in the UK in 2009. And all I would say is that indivisibility is so easily divided that it's a very controversial statement. But it is a good start to thinking about the built environment, to have that cross-professional input and cross-professional elements. But I would say this, that design-led planning is an aspiration rather than a reality in most parts of the world, to my mind. So there's a terrific test, really, in this new document to make it work and make it work effectively. So the abolition of CABE, that has been the most traumatic thing for my field of urban design and urban planning, I think, for a very long time. A tremendous step forward with CABE, but its loss in 2010 as almost the first act of the new coalition of Liberal Democrats and particularly Conservatives was really a very, very significant negative step back from design improvement. Fortunately, in Scotland and in Wales, we still have our own bodies, but they're on so much smaller a scale. And it's interesting too, because CABE is going to get a thorough evaluation from academics at London University College. But unfortunately, I don't have access to that, so I can't bring you any nuggets from it. But first thing I want to say about Better Placed is that it will be much stronger for being kept within the New South Wales government. Because I think the problem for CABE was that it was the kind of design arm of government. It wasn't thoroughly embedded. And as a result, housing policy was going in one direction, or the absence of housing policy was going in one direction, and CABE was going in another, whereas the two really need to be carefully harnessed. And I think that's what you heard this morning. So that was a particularly important thing. But the problem for CABE was it never really had this reality check of the actual nature of negotiating with local planning authorities and of negotiating with developers. And I think that's what's really has proved to be really needed. And I would urge, really, in the context of Better Placed, that you have another look at the affordable housing question, and particularly the revival of the 2009 Strategic Environmental Planning Policy, because you definitely need something in terms of genuine inclusivity, in terms of your design ambitions. Otherwise, livability will be a very distant goal. And I'm reminded of that really because only a few days before I left, there was the UBS report on global financial cities, in which London was second most unaffordable city in terms of the current pattern of development. And Sydney, of course, was only a little way behind in fourth. What really shocked me was that Vancouver, a city with a fantastic design heritage, and one of the great achievements of the last year, has become the #1 city. But that is the sort of problem that Sydney, London and Vancouver share, where we have such a huge influx of overseas purchases, which has got very little to do with the local economy on one level, but it is a huge threat to what happens in the real world. The problem now in the UK is that we are into a full-scale neoliberalism in terms of urban policy, and things have really moved significantly towards a shutdown of many initiatives. Remember that the proposition of neoliberalism really is that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual freedom within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. That's David Harvey's definition. And what has happened in the UK, really, is that there is no more social housing provided by the state. The social housing that the state provides is being sold off at a rate of knots, being sold off to people who then resell it, being sold off to the rentier class who want to rent it out. And there is so little new construction that those acts become particularly problematic. The new Labour government that brought us CABE and brought us the urban renaissance failed to repeal those two pieces of legislation. So we now are in a very difficult situation. And of course, in the wake of the 2010 financial crisis and the Conservative government, we now have a huge cost-cutting exercise, which is really undermining what we try to do. And the major reduction comes in affordable housing. Affordable housing has simply been redefined. Whereas it used to mean something like 30% of household income, it now means up to 80% of market rents. And that, of course, means that close to 80% is the figure that's used by development industry, and that is not affordable by anybody's standards in the current context. So there's a widening gap between housing ownership and rental. My generation, our generation, say, it doesn't impact nearly directly on us, it's on the younger generation. It's our children, maybe even our children have been fine because we have catered for them. But it is the younger generation which is now labelled generation rent in the UK, which is the really hard hit. And the widening gap between rental and home ownership is absolutely dramatic. And it's a long-standing crisis with no prospect of being resolved. And of course, CABE was never able to deal with that situation. It was not part of its remit. It was focused upon design, not social equity in any sense. So CABE did a huge amount of very good work, but it isn't work which directly impacted upon the current situation that we face. They provided an improved evidence base for urban design, a tremendous research program on things like the value of urban design, that you could demonstrate how it improved the bottom line for developers, and the value to the community as well. The issue of housing layout, how that needed to change. I mean, this new document about middle density housing was something that they were very interested in. But they were also interested in layout and trying to control traffic, reduce parking and all those kinds of things. So those issues were part of its building for life idea of 20 criteria by which you would judge things. And when they completed the judgment, they found that 18% of housing across the UK was good, or very good. But it was a big wake-up call. The quality of housing really was not something which was in keeping pace with the whole issue of improving urban design. They did a lot of work on urban design skills, particularly with planning principles, and a lot of best practice studies of things like supermarkets, high-rise buildings, town centre renewal, which have become standard documents in good practice. They provided a lot of improvements in the process. This notion of design and access statements, every planning application had to have a rationale for a stated rationale, both for its accessibility, but particularly, of course, for its design quality. It produced a series of evaluation tools, contributed to that production, particularly the Building Research Establishment's Environmental Excellence Programme. And that was a very significant element, very similar to the LEED process in the United States. The Building for Life mechanism was another one. Space Shaper was a third one, this idea that the public could judge spaces. And this was a kind of technique for them to do that in a very accessible one. And they also tackled the issue of public awareness, raising awareness with regional architecture centres, most of which today are threatened by closure because the funding for them is so limited. And then the design review process, which everybody has picked up on, really. Many of the cities have design review systems, certainly the larger ones, and certainly we do in Wales, we do it in Scotland as well. Design review, though, is a very tricky situation. You can advise, but you have very little teeth. CABE, of course, had an elite body of people who could intervene in many major London projects, and they did that very successfully. But actually, there isn't a really good record, such as the thing that Rob is providing, in terms of the quality of development, and in terms of the design review process. So it was a useful process, but a rather open-ended one. And the problem in all of those elements, really, is this mismatch between what central government is doing, or in the case the state government is doing, and what CABE was doing. And that there was no really strong linkage. And that's what I hope for from Better Placed, that there's something really strong in terms of these relationships between these two disciplines, because I think that's absolutely essential. Now on to Sydney and the success of the competitive design process. I remember when I sort of discovered it back in 1999, a key idea from Mayor Sartor, who was at his peak in that sense, a very new and vibrant force within the city. A brilliant idea, really, which fitted the city's kind of its character and its competitive nature, but something which could be fitted into the development control process, I think, with very easily. And of course, the generous bonus of 10% height or 10% on the floor space ratio, that was a really significant incentive, I think, and so it has proved. And of course, Professor Freestone's team have analysed a number of cases, 25 in some detail, where they've looked at the way in which the project evolved, and they've shown that there's a wider participation of architects and juries, there's a wider participation of architectural firms in competition, there's a wider range of winners, and that 60% of the schemes that have been through the process have won architectural awards of some kind. I know that Professor Freestone is thinking of that the project is nearly over with all this, with this particular aspect of his presentation, but I think actually his team should have much more to say about the design process in Sydney, and I hope that he will be able to extend some of that work significantly, especially when it comes to the issues of public realm benefits and things like that, a more consistent approach to heritage, because if those can truly be demonstrated and catalogued, explained and illustrated, I think it will make a very fine piece of work. He's always wondering whether this can be absolutely attributed to the competitive design process, but I would say there's no point in shilly-shallying, and you go out there and you say, look, these are the products, this is the outcomes, make up your own mind if you like. So this work is a very important element in telling the world, I think, about how the competitive process works, and I think it's very valuable. So the whole question really comes back to what I think are the wider issues of design quality in Sydney. If you could argue that the competitive process is taking care in many senses of commercial buildings and hopefully working its way down through the system in terms of its response to particular environments, then I think the key question for Better Placed is, of course, this whole thing about high-density housing, etc. I think the withdrawal of the affordable housing set was a terribly retrograde step, even though I know it faced enormous opposition from the developers. But I think that is something that needs a second look at it. In the same way as the SEP 65 program, look, it needs to have a look at that and see what it has achieved. Is there a case for reintroducing this affordable SEP? Probably not in central Sydney, but I would have thought beyond central Sydney, perhaps definitely. Otherwise, where is this equity and inclusivity going to come from? And the missing middle, I think, well, that's another clever move which offers some great potential. So those are the sorts of things that have occurred to me during my short-term stay. I can't help but compare Sydney and London. London has got 436 tower blocks on the books at the moment, which is unprecedented. And it will be a tremendous change in the nature of the environment. Almost all of them are residential and not commercial. Most of them are financed by foreign money, and most of them are selling to overseas investors. So we in London have a tremendous threat knocking on our door. What I want to ensure in my very short stay here, through the work that I've already seen, is that Sydney doesn't fall into that trap, and it continues to provide such a wonderful place to live and a wonderful place to visit. Thank you.